I want to leave time now for each of you to give us one policy takeaway from this discussion and from our findings on this poll. I'll start with you, Bob.
We have a serious problem in the country, and it really relates to the response here. The country is very, very polarized. A share of Americans believe what we discussed today are just individual incidents. It's not a broad pattern. This is going to exist unless we can find a way to routinely survey, I know it's more expensive, the views and experiences. Let's assume there was a hypothetical president who said something that some group would think inappropriate. The only way you would know how inappropriate they thought it was if the next morning on the news it said XY Native American community found this unbelievably offensive. But we don't have an ability, and so people watch the news, and many reporters are stuck. If I agree with the government or not, I end up using a poll. 6 out of 4, blah, 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 say this. Unless we can find a way to add this community so routinely, they're not only talking about their own lives, but the issues that the government does, you lose the whole media. You're there, I'm in a congressperson's office trying to convince them of something, but they don't have a pattern that they see. And they always say, oh, the organizations just represent some small group. We really have to find a way, I know it's more expensive, it's harder than everything else, that the views of today's Native American community are on the front pages when people talk about how the country responds. Because there's a share of people who just believe, oh, there's a loud voice, but it's not very broad. And this is something, I know it's more expensive, but it has to be included in routine surveys. So there is a voice nationally from the community here.
Thank you. Stephanie?
You know, policy change is interesting because policy is a reflection of the culture. Just in the last year, we've seen how the culture in talking about discrimination has changed tremendously as people have felt more empowered to discuss their own hatred and dislike for other groups. So when I think about policy change, part of it is how do we infuse it into every part of the culture? So work to change ideas. You know, part of it, there's a Corn Tassel has a great everyday acts of resurgence. If everyone who heard this talk today took one step in saying, I'm not, in every situation, I'm not going to let Native people be invisible. And, we start to think about what does that mean in psychology for clinicians? What do we need to do? It really is about changing the conversation and changing the narrative, and that requires a larger cultural shift in America. And so, policies are a reflection of ideas. And so this conversation is a good start. We need to have many more of these conversations.
Yvette?
Well, data is so important. It can determine whether communities get resources, funding, services. It can mean the difference between life or death. And funding is often driven by data. So we need more data, and we need more conversation about it. I remember when I worked in the government, former Secretary of HHS Sylvia Burwell said that data helps us go from rhetoric to reality. The rhetoric is, oh, it's not so big of an issue. This data helps show that discrimination is occurring, and we have to talk about it. We have to address it because people's lives are depending on us to be able to do that, all of us, to try to address discrimination in our communities. So more data, more conversation.
Michael?
I think I want to circle back to the video with Anthony's path and the discussion about culture. In that we were talking about a sort of an ease with this with talking about culture and a sense of connection to place, and how important that is, and sort of received wisdom that tribes across North America have as a resource, as a treasure, in many senses, and that and they could have almost lost it, and that the rest of us actually probably desperately need that connection, that same sense of connection to nature and place. We are sort of ironically as a race, as humanity, facing an existential challenge with climate change, for instance, and you could argue that is a result of our own generic disconnection from nature and place, and so all of humanity needs needs that reconnection. And so, just for instance, and we need policy interventions to do that. So, last March, the New Zealand Parliament, for instance, granted personhood to a river, the Whanganui River. And there will be sort of like, we don't think anything of granting personhood to a corporation. That's nothing to us. But they did this kind of radical thing of granting legal personhood to a river, and there are Maori custodians, guardians for the river. It's just an interesting thought. May never work in the United States, but it's a radically different way, and it might be the time for us all to be thinking about that from sort of received indigenous wisdom.
Well, thank you all. Thanks for those ideas and comments. This concludes today's forum. I encourage everyone who's watching to continue the discussion online at the Forum website, and that's forumhsph.org. On behalf of NPR, Harvard, and the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, thank you.